Brian just didn't want her to go out, and it was a jealousy issue, and it caused a huge argument between them, and she came over and cried and just talked to me about what happened and told me all that she was comfortable telling me.
In our previous analysis, we looked at how Gabby's girlfriend, Rose Davis, had an indirect role in the Spread Creek camp incident. In this episode, we're going to take that analysis even deeper. Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. So if we review the same Daily Mail article, one of the only interviews, in fact, I think the only interview of Rose Davis, Gabby's best friend in Florida, we see there's actually a precedent. We see that there's actually a previous occasion where Gabby and Rose were going to go line dancing at a bar, and Brian actually prevented that from taking place, and Brian hid Gabby's ID away, causing Gabby to have to go home, and this led to a confrontation. And if you think about it, that confrontation was indirectly about Rose. Rose wanted to do something, Gabby wanted to do something with Rose, and Brian didn't like that idea. The other thing that is quite interesting is on the many occasions that Gabby and Brian fought, Gabby would invariably go to Rose, spend the night at Rose, in order to take a break from their argument. So from Brian's perspective, you would have the situation of when things didn't go well between himself and Gabby, Gabby would always go to Rose. And so you can see how Brian would have thought about Rose to some extent as an enemy, as someone who might be critical of their relationship, and also as a threat to their relationship. And obviously, she was only a threat in the sense that Brian was insecure, Brian was inadequate, Brian wasn't very confident, Brian wasn't a very good and capable boyfriend, and he seemed to fear that and know that. Now, although Rose did speak to the Daily Mail, she was recorded on camera giving a couple of interviews, and I played a brief clip of that interview at the beginning of this episode. It's unfortunate that this particular segment that she said, we don't have the actual words for or the extended version, but she actually said the following. She said, Rose said, Brian's got these jealousy issues and he struggles from what Gabby called these episodes where he would hear things and hear voices and wouldn't sleep. That's quite a statement to make. And again, that is Rose talking about what Gabby told her about Brian. Episodes that came and went, episodes associated with hallucinations and paranoia, episodes where part of the paranoia was around jealousy. What could the source be of this? Before we get to that, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. Like, share, leave a comment. Bear in mind, later today we'll have the 21st episode of the Van Gogh Letters series, dealing with someone actually accusing Van Gogh of being a quote-unquote vicious character. So that's going to be quite an interesting episode. Look out for that at 3 p.m. Eastern Time. And let's get started. So what could be the source of Brian having episodes where he couldn't sleep, where he would hear voices, where he suffered from paranoia and hallucinations? Well, one substance that encapsulates every single one of these symptoms is cannabis. Cannabis can cause hallucinations, changes in mood, amnesia, depersonalization, paranoia, delusion, and disorientation. According to the site rethink.org, quote, you might find it harder to concentrate or remember things. You may find that you can't sleep well and you feel depressed. You may also feel hungry or like time is slowing down, end quote. But the important part to bear in mind here is that some of the typical symptoms of cannabis use include all the symptoms that Rose is talking about Brian experiencing, right? Hallucinations, paranoia, jealousy issues that come about as a result of the paranoia, and especially Brian hearing things, hearing voices, and not being able to sleep. Now, interestingly, in the Kate and Armstrong case, there has been this sort of discussion whether yoga is always good for somebody. And there are certain instances where yoga can actually not improve anxiety levels, right? The same actually applies to cannabis. Cannabis, people tend to think, always improves moods and always has a calming influence. But the reality is it doesn't always do this. Research has actually found a link between cannabis and developing psychosis. Cannabis can also easily make you paranoid when used in certain quantities. Now, it's no mystery that Brian and Gabby were using cannabis during the van life journey. This is referenced several times in their social media. There are photos of Gabby holding on to, more than one actually, there are several photos of Gabby holding on to what looks like a spliff or something like that. And then there are also direct references to weed as well. Now, I don't want to say that the culprit in the Gabby Petito case is weed. And I don't want to say the culprit in the Caitlin Armstrong case is yoga. I simply want to say that that is part of the makeup of this person. That is part of the fabric of that particular case. And so one's got to take that aspect and add it to things like control issues and insecurity and an introvert who's struggling to individuate as a person, trying to find his sense of self. Well, do you think cannabis smoking is going to help a young person who doesn't really have a job find his way? Or is it going to help him avoid thinking about it? Now, Brian himself seemed to be aware he had mental health issues, saying at one point he didn't want his mental health to be a burden on others. I think that is actually referenced in the Vanity Fair article from Kathleen Hale. Nevertheless, he seemed to find succour for his anxiety in the same things many of us do: music, movies, books, and art, and of course marijuana. It's hard to say whether the original psychology led to the interest in books like Jeff Vandermeer's Annihilation. Published in 2014, the movie version starring Natalie Portman came out on Netflix in 2018. It's a story where a group of women enter the wilderness only for them to die one by one in mysterious but invariably violent circumstances. Brian was reading this book during the van life journey. Was he sometimes reading this book while he was smoking something? One area that I found increasingly fascinating but also disturbing, and at turns terrifying, is the muddying and the murking of the boundary line between reality and fiction. What happens when you can't get the two straight? What happens when reality becomes fantasy, wishful thinking, and fiction? What happens when fantasy, wishful thinking, and fiction becomes your reality? The simple scientific answer is that while things might start off warm and fuzzy, the inability to interpret signals from the real world leads to a sort of cascading maladaptation. And if your response to reality is to deliberately or accidentally run from it, evade it, soothe it, or fictionalize it, generally just trying to avoid it, reality arrives all the same.
Dread it, run from it, destiny arrives all the same. And now it's here.
Eventually, the ability to deal or cope with reality, and here I'm referring to psychological resilience, well, eventually it dissipates if that is going to be your approach. The self, when fully and finally exposed to the raw gnaw of reality, is like a nude figure that has never felt the sun, which is now suddenly exposed to nuclear radiation, but this time with no 2 million sunblock on standby.
Anybody not wearing 2 million sunblock is going to have a real bad day. Get it?
Now, ironically, that scene with Sarah Connor in the movie Terminator 2 is actually filmed where she's in an asylum, and it seems that she's struggling with reality. And the question then is, does she know what reality is, or do her guardians, do the people in the ward know what is reality? So from here, I want to break down the analysis into a couple of sections: the easy life, the good life, and this is in terms of Brian, also how young love began for Brian and Gabby, and then also how fairy tales and nightmares are born, and then finally the psychological life of Brian revisited. So in terms of the easy life, Kathleen Hale sketches a cogent portrait of Brian in her Vanity Fair article, where she describes Brian as a loner and a weirdo, couch surfing at home for months on end. When he wasn't mooching off his parents, he seemed to be mooching off friends. Do you remember early on in this case when people argued about whether Gabby and Brian lived in a condo owned by his folks or actually lived with Brian's parents? The answer is both. According to Vanity Fair, quote, "To secure his hold on Gabby, Brian proposed marriage. Gabby said yes. But Brian had no way to support his fiancée. He sold bookmarks online for $4 and hadn't had a real job in months. While researching alternative living arrangements, he briefly considered moving with Gabby into a storage container, but even that option turned out to be prohibitively expensive." End quote. Brian was also a guy who would get pissed off pretty quick. Why do you think that is? And that brings us to the second point, the good life. Social media, especially Instagram, is about strutting your stuff, showing just how good life is to you, showing how young and beautiful and desirable you are. Much of the fabric of social media, especially of 20-somethings, is about bragging about how great life is to them. It's sort of a competition to see how jealous you can make everyone feel about your particular lot in life, because you're special. The reality is it takes hard work and suffering, pain and sweat to win the reward, and often these are disproportionate. Often the difficulty and the struggle is hidden, along with the scale and scope of that struggle, while the good life is openly bragged about. The trouble is, when you're 20, the easy life doesn't necessarily simply translate to the good life. Youth, no matter how coddled, can only couch surf on the kindness and charity of the parental figure for so long. And that brings us to the next element, how young love begins. How did it begin with Gabby and Brian? How did things start between Gabby and Brian? Well, Gabby loved the beach, and this allowed Brian the chance to make her wish come true. Brian was sort of acting as the wish fulfiller, and then you sort of wonder how it feels for Brian when Gabby gets everything that she wants, and when Brian wants something, he has his hopes dashed instead. Brian, thanks to a happy quirk of fate, was able to offer Gabby a magic carpet ride to a beach. Now, according to Vanity Fair, quote, "When the two first started talking, Brian's parents had just purchased a new Florida vacation house in Sarasota County, that's in Florida, and that is a popular travel destination for college kids on spring break, according to the article. Brian's parents owned a couple of properties actually in Florida. The one in Northport, Florida, had a swimming pool, and Brian had his own bedroom there with a life-size Darth Vader helmet on one of the shelves. Well, guess what? Gabby also loved Star Wars. Brian also had a baseball hat collection and a patriotic red, white, and blue gun decorated in stars and stripes." End quote. It's important to stress that at the time Brian and Gabby knew each other, they were in Long Island, New York, which during the pandemic era was a sort of prison. If you were at school, New York felt like a leper's colony where you couldn't have any fun, just like Luke Skywalker when he was on Tatooine, a place that he yearned to escape, or Rey in Jakku. And so Florida twinkled like stars in the distance of some faraway sea. If you didn't have any freedom, Florida seemed like this haven beckoning in the distance. And you could be free in Florida, which means you could be happy. And once there, it probably felt like the happiness would last forever. Kathleen Hale rightly notes that more than 90% of the kids at their school, the school that Brian and Gabby went to, went on to attend college. But for some reason, Brian and Gabby did not. They wanted an easier, simpler, happier life. They wanted the roller coaster ride to keep on rolling. Gabby didn't seem to want to avoid work as much as Brian did, though, but they both did seem intent on avoiding anxiety. Besides lounging on a beach, what's the typical way youngsters escape the world? Have a look at what's in Gabby's left hand in this image. No, not the one with a lollipop, the other left hand. If Gabby and Brian liked getting high together, it wasn't all moonshine and roses. According to Vanity Fair, quote, "Gabby and Brian differed in their view on guns. Brian's family collected them, while Gabby had once starred in a local artist's low-budget music video, Irreplaceable, commemorating the 2012 Sandy Hook shooting, end quote. You'd think that this might be a deal breaker, but somehow Gabby and Brian moved past their opposing views on violence. And now we go into the next element. How are fairy tales and nightmares born? The van life adventure was actually predicated on a prior trip that turned out really, really well. So the summer epic of 2021 was really just a bigger version on a grander landscape, large in scale and scope, to the California trek Gabby and Brian went on in her Nissan 2 years earlier. Going back to Catherine Hale's Vanity Fair article, she describes how that whole adventure came about. And I think she does so very eloquently. She writes, quote, "That fall, a decision was made. Brian and Gabby would quit their jobs and travel full-time for a few months. This is the fall of 2019. They drove from Long Island, New York to California, stopping in Texas and Colorado. And in Colorado, Gabby raved about marijuana. With a lollipop in one hand and a vape pen in the other, she climbed Pikes Peak until the air around her felt thin. While Brian drove the Nissan, she sat in the passenger seat, a blunt pinched between her thumb and forefinger. That's in the words of Catherine Hale. And obviously, if you go to the Instagram, you can actually see that blunt between her thumb and forefinger. Going back to the article, quote, "Green prairie whipped by on either side. Sorry, New York," she thought, "but you're nothing compared to this." At night, they slept in Walmart parking lots, reclined in Gabby's Nissan, and watched the shooting stars. The trip ended at the Santa Monica Pier, where they rode what Brian called a Ferris wheel with a serious view, and Gabby asked Brian to photograph her standing in front of Zoltar, an animatronic fortune-telling machine. This is the part that is really important to highlight here. After the Santa Monica Pier reposted the photo on its official Instagram page, again, this is quoting from the Vanity Fair article, so well observed, so well spotted by Catherine Hale. So after the Santa Monica Pier, the official site, reposted this photo on its official Instagram page of Gabby standing in front of Zoltar, Gabby started to think that she might be able to make it as a travel blogger. That is how the fairy tale started. So the good life is easy and the easy life is good. Well, in fairy tales, yes. But the one thing the good life doesn't teach is how to deal with difficulty or conflict. The one thing you never learn from the easy life is how to deal with difficulty. That's hard because, as many of us know, live in the real world, much of life isn't easy. The hardest part of the hard life is when it's juxtaposed with the easy life. If you've had the easy life for a long time, the hard life is even harder. When you're used to the easy life and the good life, and real life, and that is the hard life, sneaks up on you, you keep pining for what was. You yearn for escape because escape is your default setting. And so reality gets worse. The hard life gets harder. And that is exactly what happened to Gabby and Brian. And that brings us to the next section, the psychological life of Brian revisited. Catherine Hale writes, quote, "But Gabby would not upload any photos of Brian until March 17, 2020, nearly 8 months into their relationship." And I've highlighted those words. Nearly 8 months into their relationship. That was the first time she would upload a photo of Brian. How do you think he felt about that? If he was already insecure, how do you think he felt about almost being hidden away by Gabby? High school acquaintances, according to Catherine Hale, who followed their 2019 cross-country trip online, were likely also surprised to learn that Brian had been on the journey. Perhaps they didn't even know that he'd been on it at all. And isn't that because Gabby was possibly a little bit iffy and in a little bit of doubt and perhaps even a little bit ashamed of Brian? Isn't it because Gabby knew all along Brian was a bit of a doubtful character? So why would she then be with him to begin with? Well, because Gabby had problems of her own. Gabby was also suffering from anxiety, and the pandemic was something that would probably make that already a lot worse. But let's stick to Brian's perspective here. After Brian made his first appearance on Gabby's social media, and that must have felt like he'd hit the jackpot, that he'd sort of reached a certain level where he was now validated, right? He'd sort of won her over, right? He was likely interested in what was being said about him. So once he made his first appearance, now he wanted to know, what were people thinking? What were they saying? How was he being received by Gabby's friends? Also, now that he had made the cut, he probably wanted to feature on Gabby's social media more and more to show, to prove that she belonged to him. After all, now that he was on her social media, he wasn't just a nobody taking photos of her to show her to the world, to offer her to the world. She was his, and the world needed to remember that. But the social media, including Bald Brian's appearance on social media, added a level of anxiety to their relationship. What was good for the goose wasn't necessarily good for the gander. If Gabby thrived on social media, for Brian it would become increasingly a source of paranoia. And isn't social media a source of paranoia for all of us to a greater or lesser extent? Now, it wasn't just a case of worrying what was being said about her, but what was being said about him and them. And do you remember what Gabby said to Rose, that Rose repeated to the Daily Mail? He would hear things and hear voices and wouldn't sleep. Now, can you imagine the paranoia from marijuana added to the paranoia of social media, where it feels like, especially when you're on social media a lot, that you're hearing things and hearing voices because you're reading them all the time? And does that help you sleep? Imagine those two unrealities mixed together. The unreality of social media with the unreality of marijuana, right? So there were people out there like Rose and disapproving parents and those who knew Gabby and another Brian from high school. They were all out there, and Brian was aware of it. What were they thinking? What were they saying? And on social media, what society thinks and says is revealed. Brian turned to books to learn about the real world. He learned that words could either conjure life or death. And he was experiencing that very thing, that fiction, as fact. What was said on social media could conjure heaven or hell. Asking someone to marry him using words could be the stuff of fairy tales. But then going back to mommy and saying the marriage was off, using words, well, that was hell. So words could also pull someone apart. What if you controlled the words? And what could be easier? And think about the double standard on their social media, where they announce that they're getting engaged. Do they announce that they no longer are, that they've changed their minds? That's how social media often works. And so when it came to Gabby's social media, that was one way that Brian could maintain some kind of lever of control. If words can pull someone apart, what if you control the words? And what could be easier than that? Making sure only the words you wanted were spoken or written. And think about the aftermath to this case, where text was sent that put words into being that aren't true, but nevertheless seem to change reality. And it wasn't only the words of others that bothered him, it was also Gabby's own words and Gabby's time spent on things besides him. Do you remember what Rose said to the Daily Mail? She said, quote, even as Gabby said in the body cam, Brian didn't even support her with her blog. Brian didn't even support Gabby with what she was doing with the blog. That is not what a fiancé or boyfriend does. That in itself made Rose feel that things were continuing to get worse, and clearly they were. She went on to say that it didn't appear that Laundry had any friends. That's why he was always in the woods camping or at the house reading or painting. And that then elevated Gabby to the most important person in his universe. And so if he lost her, then he lost everything. So how did Brian deal with being a social outcast? Well, by running away to the woods, by running away into books, by running away into art, by using cannabis perhaps excessively. But essentially, how did Brian deal with being a social outcast? How did he deal with difficulty? Well, by running away. And the van life adventure was for Brian running away only for social media to pursue them wherever they went. Remember Nicole Schmidt, Gabby's mom? She would later tell 60 Minutes, "I loved getting the updates on social media. I was in awe of what she was doing."
I loved getting the updates. I was in awe of what she was doing. It was just amazing.
Well, if you think about it, the envy worked. Now Rose wanted to join them. Rose, who was following her friend on social media, following what her friend was doing on Instagram, well, now she wanted to be part of that. And if Brian thought the Instagramming was bad, Gabby was about to take things to a whole new level with YouTube. She did that on August 19, 2 days after Brian left her in a hotel in Salt Lake City. I think that is so significant that it is only when she's left completely alone that she's actually able to produce this video, which kind of suggests that when she's with Brian, she's not able to produce these videos, that he's not helping her. What were in the comments to that first YouTube video? YouTube is like the Wild West when it comes to social media. People feel they have every right to be as nice or as nasty as they please, because what they see isn't real. It's not a real person. It's just a hypothetical, and they can say what they like about it. The bottom line, though, is that Gabby Petito's YouTube video was posted while Brian Laundrie left her in Utah. And so, what was that like following the publishing of the YouTube video? If Brian didn't much like how much time Gabby was spending online or on social media, and we know for a fact that this was part of the arguing that was going on that led to the Moab incident. The YouTube stuff was about to make it all worse when Brian rejoined her. In other words, Gabby was going to be spending time not just Instagramming, but on YouTube as well. That meant Brian's possession of Gabby was going to become even more tenuous. And now think about Rose's words again. He would hear things and hear voices and wouldn't sleep. Think about how social media could aggravate that. Remember Rose saying, "Brian had a jealousy issue. I'm her only friend in Florida to my knowledge, and that's not because she can't make friends. He," meaning Brian, "just didn't want her to have friends." Now imagine that feeling, that psychology and social media, the risk, the threat, the danger that social media could weaken the already weakened engagement, that social media could start interfering with their relationship, that social media could sort of lure her away from him and make her realize that perhaps he wasn't good enough for her. And of course, he wasn't. So think about it. Preventing Gabby from having friends in the real world is one thing, but what about in the social media landscape? What about in the online Wild West where Brian's power was tenuous and Gabby's was growing day by day? Brian had been able to get a toehold into Gabby's life because she was so isolated. Well, the whole online thing was going to change that game. And Kathleen Hale, in her Vanity Fair article, touches on this changing of the game, where she writes, quote, "Gabby, for her part, had lost touch with some acquaintances from Blue Point, New York, where she grew up and graduated high school." And then in the article, quoting Rose, she said, "Her friends from New York were bullying her when she got with Brian. It was something about Brian they didn't like her being with. She was upset about it once. I went through it with her and she was like, screw them," end quote. But now social media was allowing her to connect back to the world in a way that he had no control over, unless he could control her phone and how much she used it. Going back to the article, quote, "He demands she be home for dinner, often cut our time short. He demand to pick her up from our house, even when I had a car and offered to drive," end quote. So those references are Rose saying that Brian would demand that Gabby do this, Brian would demand that Gabby not do that, kind of thing. Brian would demand, and the free-spirited and freedom-loving Gabby would find Brian increasingly demanding and eventually suffocating. If this journey had been born to escape the suffocating symptoms of a virus, Gabby had somehow brought along a parasite of another kind, someone who lived off her, fed off her, and had no life of his own, someone who needed her to have a life. And if she, in her spirited liveliness, wanted to do something impulsive or fun, well, that then seemed to drain the life out of him, which in turn drained the life out of her. And because Brian had no friends, any and all friends of hers were a clear and present danger to him, especially because he feared their relationship was unraveling, especially because their relationship was unraveling. He would hear things and hear voices and wouldn't sleep. And that brings us to the final element, so close and yet so far. If Brian's parents coddled Brian, they did the same to Gabby. According to the Daily Mail, quote, Nicole Schmidt described how Brian's parents had been warm and welcoming to Gabby during their relationship. She recalled a time when his mother even knitted her future daughter-in-law gifts for Christmas. And so that is really Roberta Laundrie, Brian's mother, knitting Gabby gifts for Christmas. That's quite a personal statement if you think about it. And so Nicole went on to say, Roberta loved Gabby like a daughter. As far as I knew, they were all very caring and treated her like one of the family. His mom was so excited about the engagement. And you can imagine that Brian being the baby of the family and the one that was not married, his older sister was married, that excitement from his mother would feel like an expectation. And how is he going to explain when that didn't happen? And so Nicole also clarified that Gabby and Brian had been engaged, but decided to call it off and go back to just dating because they felt they were too young for marriage. But it was actually Gabby who called it off. It wasn't Gabby and Brian who called it off. It was Gabby who called it off, possibly because of pressure from her biological father. But the point is, the engagement was called off from Gabby and Gabby's side of the family. That's really important to stress. Going back to the Daily Mail article, quote, I think they kind of put that on hold because they felt it was a little fast. They were excited at first, but then they were like, let's just wait. We're very young. So they were really just boyfriend and girlfriend, she said, end quote. Well, they weren't. Brian saw Gabby as his fiancée, and as recently as the Moab incident, Gabby also referred to Brian as her fiancé. And this is the crux of the matter. Brian wanted to cement the relationship, to gain marital certainty, to possess Gabby, whereas real life was starting to interfere with that fiction. Rose, Gabby's father called him Brianna, and now social media. The Moab incident had been a close call as well, too close for comfort. All of these were elements of real life that were intruding on Brian's reality. Brian had discovered in July and August of 2021, when he was alone with Gabby in the van, that really they weren't alone after all. Gabby would call home every other day. Gabby had to engage with followers in order to woo them and earn some money. Gabby had friends and family that wanted to know how she was, but no one was calling after him. He saw this, and Gabby saw this too. They both started to experience how they, as individuals, fitted into society in a different way or didn't fit, how their relationship was or wasn't accepted by those around them, how rigid or fluid the one was in relation to the other. Whatever the recipe for this dynamic, and we can't know what it was exactly, what we do know is that it led to a bottom line result, escalating tensions. Rose also told the Daily Mail, quote, Brian had this composure as a sweet, nice, caring guy, but you could tell he's a little off, a little weird. Like he'd set up our hammocks when we'd go to the beach, but wouldn't sit with us, which I found bizarre. End quote. Brian seemed to embrace his bizarreness as if he knew his mental health was off track, hence his avatar, bizarre design. But if he seemed sweet and self-deprecating about it, that masked a deeper malaise of inadequacy. He felt inadequate because he was deeply inadequate. If the idea was to be independent and to work at making a living on social media, Brian was deeply unsuited to the task. Not only was he lazy, he was scared. Not only was he not independent, he had no idea how to not be dependent. Going back to what Rose told the Daily Mail, she said, quote, Rose and Gabby were so close that they'd share their locations with each other through an iPhone app in case we got lost, Rose says. But when Brian Laundrie found out, he made Gabby delete it, she said. I didn't push the issue because I didn't want it to cause an argument with him, Rose said. Brian was always worried she was going to leave him, Rose added. It was a constant thing to try to stop us from hanging out, end quote. Now, if you think about sharing their locations through an iPhone app, isn't it possible that Brian and Gabby shared what they were doing, their sort of phone activity, in the iCloud, where he would know what she was texting or saying and vice versa? Don't you think if Rose and Gabby were sharing that and Brian wasn't very happy with it, that Brian would want a similar kind of access to Gabby instead? So if Brian thought his relationship, let alone his engagement with Gabby, was hanging from a thread after mid-August, after the Moab incident, after separating from Gabby for a week, wasn't he right? It was hanging from a thread. It was unraveling like a ball of yarn swept into a social media twister. Rose Davis would later say that the body camera footage that she saw, the whole Moab incident thing, reminded her of the ID episode in Florida, where they were going to go line dancing and that led to a huge argument. In other words, Brian had tried to control Gabby before, and his meanness to her made her feel scared and tearful. And wasn't she right to feel afraid and unhappy? Going back to the article, quote, last summer, Gabby was driving to a bar to go line dancing with Rose in Sarasota when she noticed her driver's license missing from her wallet. Gabby returned home and confronted her boyfriend, who Rose said admitted he took her license. Brian didn't want her to go out with me, so he took it, Gabby recalled. Rose said she was so hysterical, she told me she slapped him and said something about him pushing her. So do you see, they'd gotten physical before. Somehow both of them saw nothing wrong with hitting one another, and yet in a real sense, both of them were crossing a line not only separating fiction from fairy tale, but also a line separating both of them from danger and death. Rose would later say, Gabby was holding back. I told her, you need to tell me the deep of what happened, but she wouldn't. Gabby was used to covering for Brian. Even then, Gabby knew if she lost Brian, she would also lose her life, meaning her home. And if she lost her home, she'd also lose her job. That same dynamic was part and parcel of the van life journey. Going back to the article, quote, Rose also tried delicately to get Gabby to reconsider her engagement to laundry. That is a big statement, because that is actually saying is that Gabby's friend tried, even though she did it so sensitively, she tried to get Gabby to rethink her engagement to Brian. And the fact that her engagement later ended, it's possible that Brian would have conversations with Gabby about it and say, what do you think? What should we do? And then Gabby might eventually let on the people that had encouraged her to end the engagement, and Brian would then be alerted to these individuals, and that would lead to him wanting to isolate her even more, get her away from these people, these doubters and dissenters, and exert even greater control over Gabby. And was he actually successful in maintaining this control? Was he capable? Was he able to actually isolate Gabby ultimately from these influences? Well, the answer is no. And he may have felt that ultimately Gabby did change her mind about him. And whose fault was that? Was it Rose's fault? Was it Brian's father's fault? Or was it, in Brian's mind, Gabby's fault, that Gabby had eventually decided this isn't going to work? And then when Brian felt that that was the case, who was there to blame except Gabby? Who was there to control and to try and force the issue with other than Gabby? So consider how Brian was willing to do anything for Gabby as long as the fiction was maintained that he was her fiancé. But eventually that fiction was worn threadbare. Eventually it was starting to fizzle, and Brian, rationally or irrationally, realized he was nothing. Now think about it. If you were on honeymoon, would you want anyone else to join you? Rose disapproved of Brian, and so to invite the disapproving Rose into his fictional theater meant that Gabby had to disapprove of him as well. You know that saying, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. That's how the saying normally goes. For Brian, it was the other way around. The friend of my enemy makes my friend the enemy. If Gabby was the enemy, and if the engagement didn't mean anything to her, then he was right. He was being used. there was nothing after all. There was going to be nothing. In reality, he'd started off as a nothing, and he'd been a nothing all along. Gabby had simply been using him to get where she wanted to go, and she was going where she wanted to go, not where they wanted to go. So what about him? He was going to be left behind. And this isn't all speculation. There's an article titled Gabby Petito Powell says she uncharacteristically blew her off before she went missing. Why was that? When Brian realized their relationship was on the rocks, that the engagement was over, he realized his life was over. And the moment he realized that, Gabby's life was over. In his head, Brian had gone from almost being married to being in a relationship to being just a friend. And then in his mind, that meant he was a nobody. Without Gabby, that's what he was, a nothing. His revenge for Gabby turning him from a somebody back into a nothing was to do the same to her. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.
I don't really know what comes next. I'm just doing my best, even though I'm so stressed out. Everything just feels like a test that I fail, so depressed when I can't seem to get out. But something deep inside won't let me quit. I swear that I'm inspired by all this shit. Tell me that I can and I won't. That's what guides me the most. Fuck your lies, I'll do what I want. I'm inspired by thirst, I'm inspired by worth. I desire your worst, so you can just hide while I work. I ain't tired, you first. I'll write a second, third verse about the lies you go disperse. You never did shit, I know it hurts. Something deep inside won't let me